Did Jesus really rise from the dead, and can that actually be proven historically? Or is it in the imagination of the believer, possibly hallucination? This debate coming up is so serious. I've never heard of a debate that goes on for 7 hours. 7 hours between Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Mike Licona. They're going to clash on this very issue of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, and if it can be shown historically. You're going to want to tune in. Make sure you go down, sign up now, get the early bird special. It is mythvisionpodcast.com/resurrection. I'm so excited to see, because the Q&A session is going to be long. There'll be plenty of time for them to cross-examine each other. You'll be able to hear things that neither side has ever said. And there's new ideas Bart has brought to the table. And I'm sure Mike Licona also is prepared with new ideas as well. I am excited to find out what becomes of this debate, because many Christians, I think, are wasting their time in thinking that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I was one of them. I also created this little intro working with Bart Ehrman's team on the debate between Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona. Tell me what you think of this, and then we're going to get into the discussion where Dr. Ehrman also makes predictions about what he thinks is going to happen and how Mike is probably going to dodge a lot of what is said, and he's going to try and pin him down.
There are over 2.7 billion Christians in the world. That's more than 1 out of 3 human beings on planet Earth. And virtually all of them think that Jesus was raised from the dead. But is it true? Was Jesus raised from the dead?
The Apostle Paul writes, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins, and those who have died as followers of Jesus are forever lost."
That's exactly what you would think. If somebody was buried in a tomb and you went there 3 days later and it was empty, you wouldn't think resurrection. No, you'd think grave robbers. Or you think, hey, I'm at the wrong tomb. The empty tomb isn't going to convince anybody.
You can't have a group hallucination. I can't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, "Honey, I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation."
Can it be shown to be a historical event? And if not, is Christianity dead?
If Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. And if we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living.
For most of my life, I was a committed Christian who believed in the resurrection. For many years, I was a deeply committed conservative evangelical. I not only believed the resurrection happened, I thought I could prove it. And I spent a lot of time and effort arguing that the resurrection could be demonstrated as a historical fact.
There was a time when I doubted the truth of the Christian message. I took 12 years and studied the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and I became more convinced than ever that the resurrection of Jesus is an event that occurred in history.
It's a religious belief, not a historical fact.
Bart says that historians cannot investigate miracle claims. He's wrong.
In this debate, I'm going to pull out all the stops to show why the resurrection cannot be seen as a historical event.
He's wrong again.
This will be the debate to end all debates.
This is the debate to end all debates.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm the host, Derek Lambert. Dr. Bart Ehrman, you're joining me again today. How are you, my friend?
Here we are. I'm doing well. Thanks.
I'm doing really well as well. I'm excited about this upcoming debate. I hear it's going to be 7 hours of you, something like that. It's like a whole day thing, unlike anything that's been done before about a debate.
Yeah, that's long, isn't it? What was I thinking?
I don't know what you were thinking. All I know is I'm excited to see what happens. So everybody who's watching, you saw the intro, you saw that commercial. go to mythvisionpodcast.com/resurrection. It's in the description, top of the comments, it's pinned. Go sign up. Dr. Ehrman, I wanted to dive just a tad bit into this. I'm not sure you and Dr. Licona will get into this, but you ask your students every time they're in your class, hey, I need you to paint the differences between Paul and the Gospels or Jesus, and finding these issues in the New Testament. I've interviewed Dr. Delsey Allison Jr. I've interviewed other academics, James Tabor, M. David Litwa, you name it, the list can go on, various ideas. And most of the scholars I've talked to are probably critical, skeptical. They think there's discontinuity between Paul and what we find in the Gospels. And what I'm actually trying to zero in on is, what kind of resurrection did Paul believe in? When we read 1 Corinthians 15.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, Paul, all the authors of the New Testament have their own views about things, and Paul's views are different in many ways from those of each of the gospel writers. But on this particular point, it's an interesting question. So, so Paul's our earliest author, and he absolutely thinks that Jesus was raised in the body. I mean, I think that he thought that the body came out of the tomb. I mean, he thought that. But the thing with Paul is that he did not think of this as simply a resuscitation of the body. It wasn't just that, like, that it was a near-death experience that, like, would go on forever. So for Paul, the body that came out of the tomb was a spiritual body, by which he doesn't mean that it wasn't a body, and he doesn't mean it was just a spirit. He means that it was a body that had been transformed into a different kind of stuff. And so in ancient Greek thinking, there are different kinds of things in the world. And so, air is different from trees, they're different. And so pneuma, spirit, is a kind of stuff. It's not what we think. We think of it as like this invisible thing that doesn't, like, and it is for the ancient Greeks, but it's actually made up of stuff.
Right.
Like we would say, like atoms or something. And so Paul thinks that what happened is Jesus' body was transformed into a glorified spiritual body that could never die. And so he was made immortal. So it was the body, but it was a body that was transformed into something else. So it wasn't just a resuscitation of a corpse.
So you said something, and maybe you slipped when you said it, because you do this all the time in talks. You said that he believed that he was transformed body from the tomb. Now, Paul says he was buried. I want to get very meticulous. Do you think he believed there was an empty tomb?
Well, yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he doesn't say anything about it. Doesn't say anything about it. And he doesn't say it was a tomb. He just says it got buried. But I don't know what he really thought. But he thought that whatever was buried came out, or came up, or something happened to it. And my point is that that's Paul's view, and it's very different from what you get, for example, in Luke and John. In Luke and John, the whole point is it's the same body. He can eat. They give him food to eat, so he apparently has a digestive system.
Yeah.
And they can feel the holes in his hands, and it's like it's the same body. And for Paul, it's connected to the body. But Paul likens it to when you plant a seed. If you plant an acorn in the ground, the oak tree that grows out of it grows out of the acorn. But it doesn't grow into a big acorn. It grows into an oak tree. And so for Paul, the thing that goes in the ground is intimately connected with what came out. It's not a different thing. It's a transformed thing. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I asked this because you have changed your mind over the years about this whole empty tomb scenario. I think you were on record saying at one point, you were arguing, well, there was an empty tomb, and you were making argumentations on what would have happened if there was an empty tomb. But now you've kind of thought maybe the empty tomb narratives are all legendary and aren't historical. That's why I was asking when you said he believed he had risen from.
Oh, yeah, but see, it's two different things.
Okay.
If you ask me what does Paul think, that's one thing. If you ask me what does Bart think, that's a different thing.
Okay, so I'm interested.
I don't think there was an empty tomb, because I don't think Jesus received a decent burial.
Do you think Paul thought he got
Yes,
so
yeah.
okay, so there is continuity in the New Testament, according to you, between Paul's idea of an empty tomb, or at least the New Testament gospel idea of an empty tomb. It's the difference comes down to the body of Jesus and how he morphs. And there's, of course, embellishments on how the tomb has multiple angels, and then there's we have soldiers, and they have embellished the narrative. But you think Paul did think there was an empty tomb?
I don't know if he thought that there. It depends what you mean by tomb. I mean, if you mean by tomb like a thing that Joseph of Arimathea had, a
Yes.
cave-like thing outside, Paul doesn't say anything about it. But all I mean is his Paul thinks that the body of Jesus was deposited somewhere, and that body then was raised from the dead by being transformed into a spiritual body rather than being a normal human body.
Okay.
And he thinks that at the end of time, all humans are going to, the followers of Jesus are going to experience the same thing. They're also going to be spiritually transformed.
That's supposed to happen next Thursday, isn't it?
Yeah, probably about 5:00.
Okay. Yeah. So just to follow up with this, in your debate with Mike, if I can get you to do some predictions, because we've talked about this. I just wanted your thoughts on that particular issue. And the Gospels seem to be legends on this whole tomb narrative thing. What do you think is going to happen in this debate between you and Mike? I don't want to give away any of your secrets and his secrets, but how do you think it's going to go? Do you think you guys are going to keep hitting walls on particular issues? Are you going to be able to get behind those walls, you think?
In my experience with this kind of debate, my opponent normally argues things that I think aren't really directly relevant to the question. And so I'd say that's one of the things to pay attention to. For example, if somebody argues, oh, Luke can be shown to be a really good historian, and based on what historians do, Luke was really good, or something like that. Well, that's an interesting argument we could argue about, but it isn't relevant to whether an ancient source written 50 or 60 years after the event that is describing a miracle would be considered by historians generally to be a reliable report. I mean, it's a reliable report to a believing Christian, but it's not a reliable report because it's can be historically demonstrated. It's what Christians believe. And I have no problem with Christians believing that. Just don't tell me that it's something you can demonstrate historically any more than you can demonstrate the miracles of Muhammad are historical, or that the miracles of Apollonius Diana, who was also taken up to heaven. I mean, we have an eyewitness report for some of these things. Does that make it reliable? so you just have to be careful, because people can be kind of slippery, and they make an argument here. Well, that's a pretty good argument, but you realize, wait a second, that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah. When I read Dale C. Allison Jr.'s book on the resurrection, and I like Dale, I really do. I think he tries to do his best, and then admits to me at the end of the day in our personal conversations, Derek, I had an experience, in 1970 something. I go, man, I love you, dude. I get it. And I don't want to change that. That's him. That's his decision. But in his book, I kind of felt personally that there was this disconnect where he says, well, 1 Corinthians 15, here's this creed. He lists all these men, 500, the 12, yada, 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 the whole nine. And then he goes, but I think there's a historical reliability to the women appearing to the tomb. Now, sure, we can make the case that that's possible, but he tried to argue that the reason Paul didn't mention it is because it's, what do you call this? Androcentric. So he's all about men. It's a patriarchal thing. It's women aren't really the main focus. But then the Gospels mention women at the tomb. And I said, that doesn't seem like, wouldn't Paul have mentioned this? Well, he was androcentric. Wouldn't the Gospel authors have been too then, if that was the case? Why are there women at the tomb, in your view?
Well, it's a long conversation. I disagree that Paul's androcentric. And I think Dale surely disagrees with that too, because he knows as well as anybody. I mean, Dale's a very, very fine scholar, but Paul, in fact, talks about women in glowing terms in his own churches. He names a woman in the book of Romans as one of the foremost apostles. And so it's not like he's against women. And the passages that people point to that it sounds like Paul's a misogynist, Dale knows as well as anybody that these are not passages that Paul actually wrote. In 1 Timothy, Paul didn't write 1 Timothy. So the androcentric thing doesn't work. It's a very good question. Why are there women at the tomb? And this is something people always pull out. Apologists always pull out. I mean, I know they do, because I used to when I was an apologist. You say, well, who would make up that women went to the tomb? It's like, everybody in the ancient world knew you couldn't trust a woman. And so why would somebody make up a story about women finding the tomb? It kind of sounds plausible until you start looking into it. There are all sorts of reasons for people who could have made up women going to the tomb. I mean, for one thing, we first find this report in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, which was written, 15, 20 years after Paul, 15 years or so. And Mark goes out of his way to show that the men disciples never understood Jesus. And the only people who understand Jesus in Mark's gospel are people you would never expect. The woman who anoints him, who's never even named, she's the only one who realizes he has to die. The only one who realizes that his death brings salvation is the Roman pagan centurion who just crucified him. And the women are told, the women realize. So like they're the outside, all the outsiders recognize the guys on the inside forget it in Mark. So why would Mark make this up? Because it's perfectly consistent with his entire gospel. That's why. So I'm not saying Mark made it up. I mean, my personal view about this is that probably the idea, the belief that Jesus was raised from the dead is probably based on several people having visions of him. They loved him. He inexplicably killed, and some of them, a couple of them had visions of them. And I think Mary Magdalene might have been one of those women, and that Mary Magdalene may have been the first one to say the Lord's been raised. And Peter later said that, and so a couple of people may have had these kinds of visions, and the first one may have been a woman. And so that's how I explain it. But there's no problem with somebody making this up. Lots of reasons people could have made it up.
Yeah, so it could be fictional. And the other thing that you point out is it's almost like Elvis Presley is somewhat of a contemporary example, right?
Oh yeah, no, Elvis is seen all the time. And people shouldn't say, well, you got these groups of people seeing Jesus, because therefore, if you got a group, it really happened. The people who always say that tell me about it are Protestants. And I point out to them, the Blessed Virgin Mary shows up all the time to large groups. Do you really think she shows up? Oh, no, they didn't. Well, they all said they did. Well, yeah, but they were mistaken. Oh, I see. So they were mistaken, but, these other people were not mistaken. So what happened to the thing about a group vision you were just talking about?
Wow.
Yeah.
So while we have a couple minutes left, I just want to go ahead and tease our audience, because I'm going to be in the stands watching, going to need some caffeine too to keep up with you guys. What should we expect on the day of the debate?
This thing's going to be stimulating. You're going to get your own stimulation just from what happens. We're each going to lay out our cases, and Mike will almost certainly talk about how the Gospels are historically good sources. I may point out to Mike that he himself agrees that there are things in the Gospels that the Gospel writers say happened that Mike doesn't think really happened. There are things that he says didn't really happen, or they report things Jesus said that he said Jesus didn't really say that. He said the opposite. And one involving the resurrection, by the way. So how are you deciding that they're reliable, except for where you don't think they're reliable? And so, it'll be that kind of thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, please go sign up right now, mythvisionpodcast.com/resurrection. It's early bird special right now. Don't miss out on this opportunity. You'll have a lifetime to be able to watch it too. So if you pay for it, you'll have access to it for the rest of your life. If you have friends over, we're not going to, hunt you down for showing your friends if they're at your house watching this debate. So just a heads up. Thank you, Dr. Ehrman. I really, really appreciate you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks so much.